Greetings, friends. Recently, in one of the issues, I already told you how the widely announced huge new Russian offensive simply choked. Offensive in the coming days. Frontal offensives, that is, along the entire front line. Strong attack on Ukraine. A large-scale offensive. Of course, the pace of the attacks is insufficient. I have already talked about it many times, I will not repeat it. We advance 3 centimeters a day. In all directions, where the Russians try to advance, they suffer huge losses, they have no success anywhere, except for Bakhmut. And in the Ugledar direction, the situation is simply catastrophic for them. But let's talk today about how Ukraine is preparing for its big offensive. I think we will stop them all little by little, smash them and prepare our big counteroffensive. The president of Ukraine, Zelensky, ordered the Russians to sit back and fear a Ukrainian counteroffensive. Let's make the Russians sit and think when the Ukrainian offensive will begin. And the Russians carried out Zelensky's order. What are they preparing for? That is, it is clear that this is for some major operation at the front. And this operation, returning to the news about the visit of the head of the CIA to Kiev, should take place by July, August. If you watch my videos but are not yet subscribed to my channel, please fix that right now and subscribe. Also, like this video and leave any comment under it so that as many people as possible can see it. And let's talk in more detail. Budanov, the head of the main Directorate of Intelligence, said that spring would be, well, maybe even fateful in this war. In the spring, there will be many events that, well, maybe even, I'm not afraid to say, will be significant in this war. Because our command is planning a major counteroffensive operation in the spring, and it is during this operation that our allies suddenly began to give us a lot of weapons, which are still not enough. What equipment do we need? A lot of equipment is needed. True, as we know, these weapons will not help us in any way, just as the HIMARS of their time did not help at all, just as artillery, for example, 777, or other types of weapons did not help. All this is ineffective, but for some reason the Russians are afraid of such deliveries, they will not be able to fundamentally change anything. Do not underestimate the enemy and understand what is being said. The importance of such supplies should not be exaggerated here, from the point of view of their ability to change something. This is very dangerous. And even more so, all this equipment, all these weapons, which the Allies give us, will be destroyed by the Russians even before they reach the front. Well, at least the occupiers hope for that. I think that most of this equipment, with the help of our Air Force and Air Force, will not reach the front. Well, at least I hope so. Hope, as they say, dies last. But Russians are always the first to die. Military escalation scares me. Let's watch. Strikes on logistics centers of the Russian army. 5 rockets. It is possible to understand the destructive power of the blow. And to the headquarters. To be honest, I am shocked that it was bombed at all. But no, they started bombing yesterday. The bomb bite started with something new. Don't these blows of your friends sometimes remind you of anything? It seems that the armed forces of Ukraine want to spoil Grandpa's holiday. If they have time to prepare, I think they plan to do it by May 9th. Let's recall how Russian propagandists discussed the future offensive of the armed forces of Ukraine in Kharkiv and Kherson regions. Ukrainians have repeatedly said that we will not succeed because they have a counteroffensive. And now they are advancing, not us. Laughter. Well, to speak is not to spin bags. Then they had a lot of fun, Skabiva even joked. That is, there are 5 cripples left and here they are, they will go. Well, good luck. Please. You and I remember perfectly how it ended for them. Of course you are interested, because everyone is trying to understand how we got so screwed up. We have everything so good there that you can't even dream of it. Now Russian propagandists, when they discuss future offensive operations of the armed forces of Ukraine, for some reason no longer laugh. What are they preparing for? Zelensky stated once again that he is confident that Ukraine will regain Crimea. You and I do not know exactly where the armed forces of Ukraine will conduct a major counteroffensive operation. And in the end, you and I do not need to know this before the active phase of this operation has begun. But the Russian occupiers themselves are very afraid for the Ukrainian temporarily occupied Crimea. Ukrainians in the temporarily occupied Crimea are waiting for the armed forces of Ukraine, and the Russians are waiting too. That is why they are erecting roadblocks and building fortifications there. How can a vacationer get to the sea, if everything is like this? There are 200 kilometers of such trenches. They are building fortifications in the north of Crimea, fearing a land operation. And they are also building fortifications, although it is difficult to call them fortifications, on the coast of the temporarily occupied Crimea. Yes, as if they are waiting for a sea landing. God protects the protected. All this indicates that the occupiers in the temporarily occupied Crimea are definitely not panicking. These are just future tourist attractions for Ukrainian tourists. Build a defense line, especially for Crimea. As they said, if it is not needed, then it will be a tourist attraction. They dug up such tourist facilities everywhere in our Crimea, wherever they could dig up, because there is no panic. All is well. We wish the residents of Crimea a good rest. The situation is stable. That's all. Don't worry. No panic. All is well. The situation here is under control. Because everything is good in reality. There are no reasons for any unexpected decisions of tourists. To all those who are in Crimea, rest in peace. I'll say it again, the main thing is not to fight. All is well. You won't believe it, friends, but in fact, this preparation of the occupiers for defense in our Ukrainian Crimea is exactly according to plan. It is still moving according to the plan, and in fact we are acting outside the norm there. What kind of plan is this then, if Crimea is, as you know, covered up? Crimea is covered, Crimea is surrounded from all directions, that is, Crimea is not threatened by anything. God protects the protected. Perhaps another wave of open new mobilization could save the Russians for some time, but there is none, so we have to prepare for defense already in Crimea. The mobilization was not carried out, and this is not good, because in November I said this phrase, I remember it very well, that if things continue like this, then we will fight in Crimea. You will remember this phrase in April. And you know, friends, I remember many things. I remember, for example, how Vladimir Putin said even before the full-scale invasion that if Ukraine joins NATO, then it will begin to retake Crimea. Imagine that Ukraine is a member of NATO, full of weapons, there are modern strike systems, just like in Poland and Romania. Who will interfere? And he begins operations in Crimea. Ukraine has not joined NATO yet, and Vladimir Putin went on a full-scale invasion, as if to prevent this from ever happening. And now he himself is afraid that Ukraine, not being a member of NATO, will go to liberate its Crimea. The next goal is an attack on Crimea and Sevastopol. Good Lord, they don't know what they're doing. As always, he definitely beat everyone. And the collaborator Saldo is also very worried, he is afraid of penetration. The threat of infiltration by terrorist groups is, of course, present. But the occupiers are worried not only about the territories of Ukraine, which they temporarily occupied, they are also afraid of the territories of the so-called Russia. Elementary access to the borders of the Bryansk region, attempts to advance towards Russia are not considered for nothing. We, soldiers of the Russian Volunteer Corps, are recording a video message from the Bryansk region. It's not bad that they took Kiev in 3 days, right? And an attack on the territory of the Bryansk People's Republic is already serious, because it is not far from Moscow. How many kilometers is it from Bryansk to Moscow? 3. 5 hours by car. I don't even want to think about it. But you have to think. In short, the Russians are waiting for the strike of the armed forces, they do not know where it will be, whether it will be an attack on Crimea, whether it is possible an attack on Bryansk, whether it is possible somewhere else. There is no mobilization, there is no supply of new equipment, all that remains is for Vladimir Putin to pray for his army. Do you feel that we are praying for you? Do you feel that, Putin? We feel it in ourselves. This spring will indeed be very important for our country, friends. But on the other hand, you can ask a completely logical question. What kind of counteroffensive are we talking about now, when we have a very difficult situation in Bakhmut? And it is true that the enemy there is pressing very seriously, attacking very seriously and even having some successes. And the soldiers who are defending Bakhmut today, and those who are not occupiers in other directions, perform a very important mission, they allow our army to form reserves for a new major offensive at this very time. That is, these are parallel processes. And pay attention, despite the fact that some of the new equipment and new weapons have already arrived in Ukraine, you and I have not yet seen them at the front. And this means that they will also be used during a counteroffensive operation. And this means, friends, that we now have to help our defenders even more actively, both those who are on the defensive and those who are preparing to attack. Because it is we, the people of Ukraine, who are a reliable support for our army. We, the servicemen of the 137th Separate Battalion of the Marines, are holding the defense in the Vuhledar area, and we want to thank our countryman Serhiy Sternenko and his followers for the Oteta Otilestaka. She has already passed the military baptism, took us in a combat vehicle and brought us from there. Since we are smelly, unwashed, unshaven, she will take us to wash us today. We thank you. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to heroes. Do not stop, friends, and continue to help the Ukrainian army. You can do it through me, you can do it through foundations, for example, Serhiy Prichula or Return Alive, you can do it through other volunteers whom you trust. The main thing is to do it without fail and believe in the armed forces of Ukraine. And remember what a high price we pay with you today in order to continue to exist, for our nation and our country to exist. Eternal glory to each and every one who died in this struggle. Greetings, friends. Recently there were protests in Georgia. The reason for the protests was the adoption by the country's parliament of the law on foreign agents. But the main reason for these protests is the total power of pro-Russian oligarch Ivanishvili. And indeed, the Russians got burned out from those protests. This is just such a demonstrative coup, a wandering Maidan. The customer, of course, is the West. The occupiers were categorically against these protests and even launched heavy artillery into battle, which was supposed to convince the Georgians that protesting is bad. Georgians, stop. They took an anti-Russian position. The Russians also resorted to threats. Their propagandists said almost verbatim that if you, Georgians, protest, the Russians will take away some of your territories. You can lose much more from such a partnership. Protests are also taking place in Moldova. But the Russians have a completely different position there. They fully support those protests. Protests in Moldova. Today there is a new rally demanding the resignation of the president and the cabinet. How does the government react? Launches a wave of intimidation, blackmail, and harassment. The representative of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs Zakharova, when she started talking about the Moldovan government, began to sing familiar songs about the Nazis. They are engaged in the heroization of Romanian accomplices and Nazis. In fact, they are repeating the path along which, under the supervision of the West, the Baltic countries first passed, then Ukraine. Indeed, Russian propagandists began to threaten Moldova and the Moldovan authorities. Force Moldova to peace. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, friends, it's important. Also, like this video and leave any comment under it so that as many people as possible can see it. And let's talk about the protests in Moldova today. But first I will say a few more words about Georgia. I want to thank the Georgian protesters for supporting Ukraine as well. Ukrainian national anthem plays, protests in Georgia scared not only Russian propagandists, but also ordinary Russians who used to flee to Georgia, and now started fleeing from Georgia when the protests started there. Sounds like Nazi Germany. My God, the city of Tbilisi, Georgia. Here, rallies are held all over the square. I'm scared, I don't know why I came here. But Kremlin propagandist Simonyan started threatening Georgians with rocket attacks on Tbilisi and was very worried that Russia would have to receive a second front. This, of course, is not in the interests of the Georgian people, but it is in the interests of the American people, because we will have to be diverted to the second front. The protests in Georgia have already ended, but I think sooner or later they will flare up again, because the dictatorship of the oligarch Ivanishvili has not gone anywhere. And the government of Georgia demonstrates such a restrained loyal pro-Russian position, despite the fact that the so-called Russia also attacked Georgia and occupied part of its territories. Well, now let's talk about the protests in Moldova. Protesters were taken to Chisinau in organized groups. And it was very easy to notice. People were trapped inside the bus because the police forbade people to go outside. Formal organizers of protests in Moldova were completely pro-Russian politicians. For example, the former president of Moldova, Dodon. I believe that everyone should unite in a single rally, a single protest. The pro-Russian Shore Party is also organizing protests in Moldova. And its representative, well, never pro-Russian, voiced his demands on Solovyov's air. We demand the resignation of the Prime Minister, who will lead with one and only goal, to resolve the conflict on the territory of our state, on our land. The authorities of Moldova want to start a war on the territory of Moldova, although the war on the territory of Moldova was started by the so-called Russia back in the 90s. But the rhetoric of this politician is very, very familiar to us, friends. We have already heard similar things from the traitors of Ukraine. He also demands that Moldova not arm itself, because why do it when the occupying forces are on your territory? Our budget still allows us to spend money on strengthening weapons and purchasing weapons. Where is Moldova and where are the weapons? We are peaceful people. If in the case of Georgia the protesters immediately said clearly what they were against, then in the case of Moldova the situation is much more complicated. There are a lot of demands. The country's leadership is criticized for its reluctance to negotiate with Russia about more favorable gas prices. When I researched this topic, I found several different formal reasons why protests were organized in Moldova. You have already heard the first, for the government to agree with the so-called Russia on a gas discount. There was another reason, to cancel the payment of utility tariffs for the population for the winter. And there was one more, there was no war. Although the war on their territory has existed for a long time, it is just in a frozen state. But quite often the so-called protesters could not even say what they were protesting against. You are holding this poster. Do you know what it says? And in what language is it written? In Moldavian. Do you know the national language? Difficult. Badly? Lived in Moldova for a short time. Another formal reason for the protests in Moldova was the decision to rename the Moldovan language to Romanian, although it is actually one and the same language. But I will not explain to you all the nuances of the Moldovan language and the creation of Moldova in general. This topic is interesting, but separate. But the point is that these so-called protesters, who came out to fight for the Moldovan language, do not know it themselves. I want to say, I am a Russian speaker. I understand that you are not very fluent in the national language. I do not speak the language. Asks a question in Moldovan. I don't speak Moldovan, but I respect it. They just want Moldova to have the Moldovan language, which they cannot speak. I am in Moldova and I want the language to be Moldovan. Asks a question in Moldovan. I only speak Russian. But in the end, friends, the real reasons for the protests in Moldova are the activities of the Russians. And this video, which you've probably already seen, shows it very well. Asks a question in Moldovan. I can't understand your language, I'm sorry. Yours is whose? Well, Moldovan. We are in Moldova. How old are you? 21. Did you learn Romanian at school? No, I'm not from here, I said. Where from? I am from Russia. Yesterday, a Russian was detained in Chisinau, who also wanted to take part in these protests. And he turned out to be a mercenary from Wagner. And in this context, Zelensky's statement that the Russians are planning a coup d'état in Moldova looks very convincing. The very first hour I received this information, I passed it on to Maya Sand. And this is very important, and there is evidence that they wanted to change the leadership of the state. That is, there will be a landing. Where can it be? When I first heard Zelensky's statement that the Russians could try to land their landing force on the territory of Moldova, it seemed almost unrealistic to me, because for this they would have to cross the airspace of either Ukraine, where there are many air defense systems and their planes would be shot down, or to cross the airspace of Romania, which is a member of NATO. But you know the Russians are seriously discussing such a scenario. And they propose to use civil aviation for their landing. There are neutral corridors for civil aviation, where our transporters can safely pass there. And the landing of an airborne division there, I think, will calm Sonda, Zelensky, and everyone. So my conclusion regarding Moldova is quite clear. The Russians are shaking up the situation there in order to change the government, in order to carry out a coup d'état there and install people loyal to Russia, the so-called Russia. But I doubt that they will succeed. At the same time, they continue to promote the topic of the so-called Transnistria. A bomb in Transnistria was supposed to kill the head of the unrecognized republic, key officials and many residents of its capital, Tiraspol. According to their fairy tale, the bomb in the occupied Tiraspol, which was supposed to kill absolutely everyone, was necessary for Ukraine to seize warehouses with ammunition. Well, the second goal is to use destabilization to attack the ammunition depot in the village of Kolbasna, where about 20,000 tons of shells, mines, and grenades have been stored since Soviet times. It is obvious that the Russians will continue to try to shake the situation in Moldova. It is 100%. In this case, we should help Moldova, at its request, to free its territories, if there is such a request, of course. And you know, friends, Lavrov rightly said recently. The countries that are located around the Russian Federation must draw conclusions. All countries that are near the temporary misunderstanding called the Russian Federation should draw a conclusion. And this conclusion is very simple. As long as the so-called Russian Federation exists, it will pose a threat to absolutely everyone. And first of all to her neighbors. Therefore, friends, we should set before ourselves the task of the strategic victory of Ukraine with the subsequent destruction of the Russian Federation. But it will not happen by itself, it will happen only thanks to the armed forces of Ukraine, which you and I must continue to help. And just now I can report to you that your copters, your birds have already arrived in Bakhmut to the 93rd Brigade. From the fighters of 93 Kholodny Yar, we thank the audience Serhiy Sternenko for timely help in the purchase of drones. They are already working on Bakhmut. Glory to Ukraine. Heroes, heroes. I am convinced that after the defeat in the Russian-Ukrainian war, the so-called Russia will definitely fall apart. But it will be in the future. And here and now, you and I are obliged to continue helping the armed forces of Ukraine.